and welcome to the second annual Bean Yield Enhancement Network Results Conference. I must warn you straight from the beginning that I am now going to record the whole of this meeting. That's for the benefit of anyone who needs to leave early or anyone who, for some reason, cannot listen live. So hopefully you're all happy that we're being recorded and that you will behave accordingly. Well, it's a great pleasure for me. Next slide, Tom. I'm Roger Sylvester Bradley. I'm Head of Crop Performance with ADAS, and it's my job to chair you through this meeting. Please, can I ask that you all keep your microphones on mute and that you don't show your webcams unless you're invited to do so. We nevertheless would really like I'm getting messages from people who are saying
they can't see it. I'll try resharing the presentation again. It says the meeting may be full, but it wasn't full yesterday.
I can see your presentation.
Okay, I think that's working now.
Good. Okay. Well, I'll start again. We've only lost 2 minutes. Welcome to the second annual Bean Yield Enhancement Network Results Conference. So we're going to consider the results from 2020. You're all very welcome, and I'm Roger Sylvester Bradley, Head of Crop Performance with ADAS, and I'm going to try and keep things to time. We've got an hour and a half to consider all the results from 2020 and hopefully to discuss them. Although we ask that you keep your microphones on mute and your webcams off, we really do want a discussion, and we're going to try and have a poll in a minute with the show of hands. You can see the hand sign on your toolbar at the top. If you're involved in Twitter, please use the hashtag it says PEN there, it should say Bean Yen. So that's BEAN, yen, and we are recording this, so please behave accordingly, and if you're not happy to be recorded, I'm afraid we'll just have to proceed without you. We do have basis and Rosso points. If you want to claim them, please look at the link that Tom is now going to put into the conversation, the chat box, and he'll probably show that again later in case people are late coming into the webinar. So if we now go to the agenda after my brief welcome and introduction, Shona and Becky are going to describe a little bit about the sort of bean industry and yen crops in 2020. And then Daniel is going to introduce yens and how they are addressing bean yields. And then Tom is going to give a preliminary analysis of the bean yields that we've got from 2020 and from the previous year, from 2019. And then we've got three farmers who have very kindly put their heads on the block, so to speak, and will talk about their farms and particularly their bean crops and how they've coped with beans in this very difficult year. And then we'll have a discussion. I hope we'll get to the discussion at about 5 o'clock, but please feel free to ask questions in the show conversation box. You can see there's a you can click on a symbol at the top which says show conversation, and you can put any comments in there, and please feel free to do so. Also, if you want to say anything during or after anybody has spoken, you can click on the hand symbol and put up your hand, and hopefully I'll notice, or Tom will warn me about it, and we can have you speak or show your face and speak during the proceedings. So I hope that's all clear. Before I finish, I want to highlight that the YENs, including the Bean Yen, are entirely an industry initiative, a cross-industry collaboration. There are lots of organisations. I think there are 13 organisations involved in sponsoring the Yen and the Bean Yen, and that doesn't just mean a little bit of money changes hands. That means a lot of effort from every single sponsor, either through providing organisation of data or advice to people who want to enter, but also helping farmers enter, as well as perhaps paying their fees. So there's a lot of involvement in the YENs in order that we can collect good data to explain yields. That's the whole purpose, as Dan will explain after Shona and Becky have spoken. But now what I want to try and do is to sort of get a feel for how easy it is to actually have a bit of discussion. So please, can you put your hand up, first of all, if you are a grower, and then hopefully Tom will tell me how many hands have gone up. Actually, I can see we've got up to 12, 13. In a little while, I'll tell you to put them down, but they still seem to be increasing. Okay, I think we stabilized at 15. So please now put your hands down. And when we get to 0, I will ask how many of you are advisors. Right, please will you now put your hands, click on the hand symbol if you're an advisor. Okay, I think we've stabilized at about 7. Okay, now if you can take your hands down, so you have to unclick, and then if you click if you are a sponsor. You probably feel that you may need to press twice, but yeah, I can see some people are clicking twice, but we seem to have got up to about 13 sponsors. Thank you very much. And anyone who's only really visiting with the sort of idea of joining the Bean Yen next year, or for any other reason, any visitors, please put up your hands. Very good. Thank you very much. I think we have 1 visitor. So most people are thoroughly involved in the Yens. Now, Tom, just put up the next question and see if that I think worked fairly well, although I am using up time. Please raise your hand if your crop or the crop that you were most involved with the bean crop you were most involved with this year, you were pleased with its yield. And I'm going to ask whether you were disappointed, and that's the alternative. So you've got to decide whether you were pleased or disappointed, but only put your hand up if you were pleased. Okay, I think we settled on about 10, 11. Okay. If you can put your hands down, and we'll ask the alternative question, which is whether you were, if you can press Tom, disappointed, I think it says. Yeah, so if you can put your hands up if you were disappointed. Looks like it's about 50-50. Very interesting. Thank you very much. So that's the end of the polls, and we'll go straight on to Shona, and then she will speak for a few minutes and then pass the baton to Becky, who will talk about the year 2020. So over to you, Shona. And
Hi there, thank you. If anyone doesn't know me, my name is Shona Duffy. I've worked for PGRO for the past 10 years, and I'm going to be the main contact going forward for Bean Yen for next year. Just to let you know, the year wasn't a complete disaster. The cropping area was up by 38%, taking it to 185,000 hectares. Various reasons why this is possible, why this actually happened. I think perhaps one of the reasons was the disastrous winter oilseed rape crop that happened, and people were looking to put some spring crops in as replacement and perhaps turn to spring beans as an alternative. But the market for spring beans is fairly buoyant at the moment. We have our traditional markets of cattle feed, human consumption and export to Egypt, and salmon fishing and feed. But there's some new markets on the on the horizon potentially. If anyone fancies trying their own fava beans in a can, they can do. Hod Madods have marketed this for some time now. They actually are marketed as organic beans, but as Becky's going to talk about how Brookit has evolved over the last few years, I'm just intrigued as to where they've managed to get the beans from to go into the can without the holes in it. Another thing that's new at the moment is a company called Good Catch. They have invented or made this product called tuna-free tuna, but that's actually using bean protein. So it's just to kind of have another thing for bean protein in there. There's a company called Halo Top, which do dairy-free and vegan ice cream. Now, their big selling point is that they are soy-free. So they've got to get the protein in there somewhere, and they actually get that from bean protein. And that's actually quite widely available. I can even buy it in my local supermarket. If anybody's been onto our stand at Cereals, they'll know this beer quite intimately. We've been giving it away for a few years now on our stand. And that's actually made from bean carbohydrate. It's quite an interesting process where they can split out the carbohydrate from the protein, and then instead of using malting barley, they'll then go on to brew it and make a fairly tasty beer. Just to let you know, that's my email address and mobile number down there. If there's any issues that, as being Yen representative for PGRO, anything that you want to discuss, any problems with your crops, we run a crop clinic. You can send your plants in to us, and we'd be more than happy to look at them for you. But anyway, just take a note of those details if you want to. That'd be great. Next slide, please, Tom. Last thing I want to mention before I hand over to Becky is the replacement for the recommended list. We've launched the descriptive list this November. We've had a similar thing for vining peas for some time, but this is the first time we've actually done this for combining peas, spring beans and winter beans. And effectively, it's just a list where you can go on to a website, search for whatever attribute you're interested in, and you'll be able to see it there. There's no judgment as to whether this variety is better than another variety. You can make your own mind up based on what you're after. So that's available to download on the PGRO website. If you're interested in a bit more detail of the descriptive list, Steve's written a very interesting article in the Pulse magazine. And I'm going to hand over to Becky now to discuss what a wonderful season we had in 2020. Thanks, Becky.
Thanks, Shona. Well, you can see behind me actually what a great season we had in some ways. I will give an overview of the season. I will talk about the weather a bit, of course. I would also like to talk about some of the sites that were Yen sites, but also were involved in an Innovate UK project that we've been running here at PGRO with Hummingbird Technologies as well. So I'll present some of the sort of preliminary overviews from that project as well. So if you could have the next slide, please, Tom. So weather's been interesting, certainly. If we look at particularly rainfall, I suppose, for the 2019 to 2020 autumn and winter period. Tom, can you just click, please? Thanks. So we can see, and as many of you know, we had very high rainfall in that period, which did impact on winter beans in particular. And then we had a very dry spring from March onwards, really. March, April and May were very dry, and then the summer was somewhat wetter from June onwards, I suppose. We've also had high levels of sunshine in the spring, if you could click, Tom, please, and then quite a dull summer. So if we have the next slide, we can see how this impacted to a certain extent. As many of you will know that we're growing winter beans or attempting to get winter beans established in 2019. It was tricky in places, and you can see from that bottom picture on the right hand side there, that was February 2020. So a number of effects of the weather age. Some people didn't get winter beans in the autumn. Some people did sow winter beans in the spring, and they've been reasonably successful. And then it dried up very quickly. So we've got a few issues around managing weeds in winter beans because of the wet weather, but also then establishment of spring beans. However, if we move on to the next slide, we can see that, you know, it has been an unusual year and difficult in some ways, but we've had some really positives as well this year. So overall levels of downy mildew, for instance, and chocolate spot, I would say on the whole they were lower than normal, and rust was present later in the season as the weather warmed up. So we've had some negative and some positive impacts of the weather, really. We also saw in 2020, particularly in those crops that were quite stressed during the spring, so particularly spring beans that went into dry conditions and then were subject to drought, an increase in the level of foot rot. And this is a soil-borne disease that is particularly difficult when soil conditions are poor. So if you've got compaction in soils, or very high temperatures, very dry conditions, or in fact actually very waterlogged conditions, foot rot is more of a problem. So it's always those high stress conditions that lead to greater infection. Black bean aphid, I would say this year was a bit more variable. Lowish numbers of aphids, I would say, overall. And I think temperatures later on in the season got very high, and that tends to knock aphid levels back a bit. So we saw some virus in crops, but I would say perhaps not as bad as we have seen in recent years. So yeah, mixed year really, I'd say. If we could have the next slide, please. When we looked at bruchid damage, and we're really fortunate actually that Frontier Agriculture send us their data for the whole season each year. So we've got data going back to 2008, but I'm only showing the sort of last 5 years really of data from Frontier. So we've mapped it using their postcode data. We can see that it was quite high again in 2020, but that it is actually slightly lower than 2018 and 2019. And that's very dependent on the weather that we get in June and July. So high temperatures in June and July when pods are setting do lead to higher levels of bruchid damage, particularly if we get high temperatures for a prolonged period of time. And as you go through the years for the last 5 years, you can see 2016, the darker blue areas are the lower levels. So you can see in the north and northern regions, we do have lower levels of bruchid damage in most years, and the lighter yellow lighter colours going into the yellow colour are where we have the higher levels of damage. So it's generally east of England, Midlands. So we had some high levels of damage in 2018. We had a very hot year, and it's just dropping slightly, as you can see from those maps at the bottom. There's a number of reasons, as well as temperatures, why bruchid damage can be high in some years. we had our first report of insecticide resistance in 2017 to pyrethroid insecticides. I think growers are often choosing not to apply insecticides in beans, and that's a good choice for them, I think, in some cases. So if we could move to the next slide, please, Tom. So the hummingbird sites that were included in YEN as well, we've had 7 sites in 2019 and 7 sites in 2020, 3 winter bean sites in each year and 4 spring beans. You can see the rough locations of these. We've really tried to go as far as we can away from PGRO without making it difficult to complete the work, because what we do at these sites that are part of this project is take a 10-hectare field, grid it into 40 points, and then take soil and plant measurements from each of those 40 points at each of the 7 sites. So it's quite an intensive period of monitoring that we go through for these sites, and we're starting to look at rather, what is a large data set from those sites. And we've got sites in Yorkshire, Cambridgeshire, Warwickshire, Bedfordshire, Rutland, Lincolnshire and Oxfordshire. If you could move to the next slide, please, Tom. So we're getting general trends showing from the data that we've got. So from the soil data, and I'll say associations, as I think will become apparent as well through the rest of other people's talks as well, is sometimes it's quite difficult to show causality from the data that we've got. So we can see associations, and one of those with soils is that we see positive association with higher pH, but our pH ranges from 5.5 up to 8.5. We saw positive associations with increased soil organic matter and improved soil structure. We would probably expect the latter two to be true, to be honest, because beans and peas react quite strongly to soil structure, and we know soil organic matter can have positive effects on yield. So we see other significant associations between soil nutrition and yield, but they're weaker in our data set, so they need further work. Foliar nutrition, so from measured nutrients in the plant tissue, we see certainly one of the ones that comes out more clearly is a positive association with increased potassium content, and some negative associations that are not as strong, but we need to look in more detail at those as well. One thing we did see was the associations between yield and the measured nutrients in soils and foliage were much stronger in 2020 than they were in 2019. And we think that's because of the increased levels of stress in some of the plants in the spring of 2020, and that some of the nutrient levels, so that where nutrient levels were higher, we were getting sort of robust reactions in 2020. We did count earthworms in 2020 as well, and we saw some strong positive associations with increased earthworm numbers. And in fact, the site with the highest earthworm content was in the top 25% yielding sites. So could I have the next slide, please? Thanks, Tom. So when we've collected NDVI data from Hummingbird Technologies, so their NDVI data shows this curve. It's taken at a number of points. So using drones, they are taking the NDVI images at quite regular intervals through the season, approximately every 2 to 3 weeks. And we can see for winter beans that we've got this sort of 250 to 300 day sort of time scale, and max NDVI tends to occur roughly 25 to 50 days after full flower. So the arrows on there are indicating full flower stage, and then obviously you get your peak NDVI. So we can see a bit more variability in 2020 in terms of canopy coverage and canopy health, and that's what NDVI is measuring really. It's a ratio between near infrared light and red light that gives an indication of canopy health really. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thanks. And in spring beans, of course, with a shorter growing season, you have a reduced number of days between drilling and the end of the NDVI measurements. And peak NDVI again is occurring after that full flower stage, and somewhere between 15 and 50 days after that. So it's quite variable again. And again, if you look at spring beans in 2020, we can see maximum NDVI reached for 2 of the sites this year was considerably lower than the other 2, and that does correlate with yield that we measured at those sites as well. So those two, the dashed green line and the solid green line, were the two lower yielding sites in 2020. If we could have the next slide, please. Thanks. When we plot the points, so our yield measurements, and I would say if you look at the left-hand scale on here, you can see that some of our yield measurements are very high. The reason for that is that we are taking samples by hand and we're calculating yield based on our initial plant counts, and then obviously factoring in no losses because we're taking the samples by hand. So we tend to see some obviously coming out at very high yields. However, the general trend here is showing that when you plot maximum NDVI against yield, you see quite an interesting response. So the greater the NDVI at that maximum point does correlate with increased yield. And I think that's really something that we might expect. It's showing that a healthier canopy, and in fact a denser canopy, is correlating with yield, or is associated with increased yield. So that needs further data analysis, and I think you know, we'll work with ADAS to see how we can make more use of this data in predicting potential yields, I think. So there's a question there actually, sorry, which I will answer right now. What's NDVI? NDVI is an image measurement basically that is a ratio between near infrared reflectance and red light that's absorbed. And what it tells you is really, I suppose, in simple terms, the canopy density and also the health of the canopy. So the more reflective the canopy is, the healthier it is. So that's what NDVI is really telling you about the canopy. So if we could have the next slide, I think it would be my final slide. Yeah, thanks everybody. We're very grateful to all the growers who took part in Bean Yen in 2019 and 2020, and particularly the growers that were also involved with the Hummingbird project. We really appreciate your efforts to help us with this. As Shona said, if anybody wants to contact us at PGRO, my contact details are here as well. And I'll finish on that point.
Thank you very much, Becky. There were a few comments about the level of bruchid damage and people thinking, stay there, Becky. Can you come back? I'm still here, yeah. So there's some questioning about the levels of bruchid damage. I mean, maybe it's not going to be particularly fruitful to discuss that now. Maybe we'll come back to it at the end. Would you be happy to do that? Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm just looking quickly at the comments. I can make a comment now. I think some people certainly have experienced higher levels of bruchid in some areas, and we know that from Yen as well. The Yen results do correlate approximately with what we see on those maps that we've got from the data from Frontier, and those people, I think, certainly in the east of England, will have suffered higher levels. But yeah, there's some variation. It's just those are average figures for each postcode point. So yeah, absolutely, I agree really about the variability. Okay. Thank you very much. Please keep those comments coming, everyone, and points of clarification about NDVI and things like that. I think we've dealt with that now, so we can go on and listen to Daniel and then Tom. So Daniel first, who will talk generally about the Yen, and then Tom will come on and talk about the results from 2020, which is very much what the Yen is all about. So over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Roger. Okay, so I just want to give a little bit of an overview of the Yen approach that what we think is really the really powerful thing about the way that we're working in the Yen, that we kind of see as being applicable to any crop and any issue, really, where we're bringing together farmers, advisors, the industry, and researchers together to tackle the question, to try and understand a system or an opportunity or a problem. And with the Yen, it's all about yield. And so we starting with the concepts. So actually, how do we understand the issue? How do we understand what's driving yield in pulses? So obviously, there's a lot of information there that we have, and a lot of expertise, and really great working with PGRO and all the people at PGRO to have that all that knowledge which has gone on over the last 30, 40, 50 years that can form how we understand yield and how we should take things forward. But the reality is, I think, with pulses is that we don't have as much of that physiology as what we do with wheat and perhaps oilseed rape, to actually kind of understand the sort of things that Becky was talking about just now in terms of canopy cover. What does a typical canopy curve look like? These kind of things. But generally those concepts and that understanding drives the things that we should be measuring and drives the metrics. And then you, as the farmers and the industry and advisors, we see it's getting the real value from the yen of being able to get that information about your crops, measuring your crops, and seeing how your crops compare to a whole community of others. And that's what we do with the reports, and you can see that for the whole range of those benchmarking diagrams that Tom will talk a bit about, seeing how you compare to others, and that having some real value. But doing that also then provides the data set that we can then analyse. And so analysing that data set to look at these associations that Becky talked about and associations that Tom will now be talking about. And that's really where we're sitting here, I think, in this meeting, is between the kind of the things that we can measure, but also what's coming out of that. What is it that we can measure that's really describes and defines the variation in yield and in performance that's out there. Because if we can get that, then we can start to think about, well, what could we do differently? What decisions could we make differently? How could we design systems that maybe will perform better? And then ultimately what we're able to get to is then to be able to test those. So as a community, we can test those ideas together, whether it's in tramline trials, or just trying something different. That we're not really doing that a great deal in the pulse yen so far, but so this is something that Frontier have been doing, and the way that Frontier are interacting with the yen is very much on the basis of testing ideas in tramline trials. So, thinking about the bean yens and what bean yen and what's really driving yield, and so this concept of biophysical potential that we've talked about before, so which we calculate for every one of the crops, which gives us this kind of limit of what are the resources which are available to our crops in terms of the amount of light available and the amount of water available that could define how much yield could be. So we have that defined by the green area index, that's the amount of light that's being intercepted over the course of the year. So these curves for winter beans and spring beans these really represent in the NDVI that Becky talked about is pretty much a surrogate of light interception, if you like, for these crops. So we've got some kind of standard curves that we've kind of imagined, but hopefully some of the data that Becky's been collecting will help us refine those into the future to get a better estimate of what is feasible with spring and bean, so winter and spring bean crops. Because obviously a winter bean crop emerge earlier, or can emerge earlier, and kind of so intercepting some of that light over the season. So in theory, should have a higher potential yield. And ultimately, we're calculating here capturing about 60% of the light over the course of the season. So in principle, capturing about the same amount of light as what we would suggest for cereals. We then look at the radiation use efficiency. So how efficiently the crop can convert the light that has been intercepted and absorbed and convert that into biomass. And there's obviously a big difference with pulses in that we've got this cost of nitrogen fixation. And so the plant, if you've got the rhizobia, the bacteria are taking carbon from the plant, and that carbon has to be paid for. That carbon is a product of photosynthesis. So we account for that in a lower radiation use efficiency. So instead of 1.4 tons per terajoule of light that we would assume for cereals, we're only assuming 1 ton per terajoule for beans. We're also then assuming, in terms of the amount of water captured, that beans can root to a maximum depth of 1 metre compared to an assumption of 1.5 metres in cereal. And we've now applied this with spring crops, that the roots can grow at 1 centimetres per day through the season. So this year that became important when we had this very dry March and April. And as well as having a lower radiation use efficiency, then there's also a lower water use efficiency, because that carbon which is being shared with the bacteria for nitrogen fixation also has a water cost as well. It took some water to produce that as well. So we have a water use efficiency of 4 grams per litre rather than 5 grams, which we would use with cereals. And then we assume a maximum harvest index of 60%. And actually, some of the crops we're seeing in the bean yen are actually exceeding that. So that's the same as what we'd have for cereals. So we put that together and we can produce these potential yield maps for beans. We're seeing potential yields between kind of 9 tonnes a hectare and 16 tonnes a hectare, depending on locations, how much radiation, how much rainfall you have, and also on soil type. So how much water your soil holds. It makes a big difference to this. The actual yields we've seen this year range from 1 tonne a hectare to 7 tonnes a hectare, so between 10% and 57% of that potential yield. And we're looking to improve this model as we go forwards, and crucially taking it from a monthly basis, which we're working on at the moment, to a daily basis. So if we look at the bean yields into 2020, this graph shows all of the yields, the national average yields in the open circles, well, for pretty much my entire lifetime, and you can see that bean yields haven't increased in the UK over that time, or not appreciably. The pink dots there are the recommended list trials, or now the descriptive list trials going forward. So you can see that it is possible to do better than those average yields, and certainly for the last 5 years, consistently achieving bean yields above 5 tonnes a hectare in those trials. And then these two last dots here, the dark green dots, so the yen from 2019, our first year of the bean yen, and the yen in 2020, where we're achieving about a tonne a hectare more as a network, as a community, than what the national average yields are. If we look at the yields that as they compare to the biophysical potential yields that we've calculated, you can see here that there's a big yield gap. We're not pushing onto the biophysical potential yield with the yields that we're achieving in the yen so far. But we do have this massive range. Yeah, so we've got yields of 7 or 8 tonnes a hectare that we've seen in the yen. But we've also got yields right down here this year in particular. Some of these crops that we've really suffered with the spring drought and establishment issues, much lower. And it's really we're really pleased to have these yields in here, because this is we learn as much about crops from the crops which are not achieving those high yields as we do from the higher ones, and that's something that that's really pleasing to see here. And it's been quite a struggle to be able to get that kind of information in the cereal yens. Okay, so there's lots to go for. Thanks. So that gap. So this is really explaining this variation. I think really here, this variation we're seeing in these yields fundamentally isn't really being driven by that variation in resources and the variation of how much light and how much water is available. So it must be something else, and that's really what we're looking at with the yen. Trying to understand what's really driving that, and that's what Tom will talk about now.
Thanks, Dan, for the good introduction. Yes, I'm Tom, and I'll be talking through the analysis and messages from the bean yen dataset so far. So Dan's talked about the yield potential model, and that is something that features heavily in the reports that you get. And you also know that in your bean yen reports, you see a lot of benchmarking diagrams. So if you came to the P yen meeting yesterday, you would have heard this introduction before, but it's important to differentiate the definition of benchmarking and benchmarks. So benchmarking is something that we do in the bean yen actively now, and that's where we create these box and whisker charts that allow each entrant to compare parameters of their crops to everybody else in the season. And we do this with these box and whisker charts, and they show the lowest, the middle, and the highest values with your parameters value shown in orange. Whereas benchmarks is something slightly different. So a benchmark is a value that is representative of a high yielding crop. So say, for example, we were thinking about seeds per metre squared, we could take the top 25% of bean yen yields, find out what seeds per metre squared they had, average them, and that might give us an estimate of a benchmark of a high yielding crop. And of course, we talk to experts in PGRO to make sure that these benchmarks are sensible. We think that we need around 100 yields to get some benchmarking values that are robust enough to put in our reports. And that is really the next step, or one of the steps on the way of that circle that Dan showed us, in terms of getting to some thoughts on designs of how we can get closer to that yield potential. What I'm going to talk about today is where we are with the data set so far. So what we can do at the moment is we can separate the data set into the bottom 50% of yields and top 50% of yields. And we can do some preliminary analysis on this. And this is just some rudimentary analysis at the moment, but it's really showing starting to show some themes that we think will be built upon as we build the bean yen data set. So what's important to note is that we can't disentangle cause and effect in this type of analysis, similar to what Becky was saying earlier. If you think about insecticide inputs, somebody might be willing to put more inputs into a crop that they perceive to be doing well. We can't disentangle cause and effect here, similar to what Becky was saying, but it can lead us in the direction of what to test next. It's also important to note that just because a factor isn't highlighted in this type of analysis, it doesn't mean it's not important. So especially things that people choose due to different conditions or sites or soil types or locations, such as seed rate. If people are making good decisions, it's unlikely to have an effect on the yields we see in the data set in a large manner, so we might not pick it out in this analysis. But of course, it's still important. One thing to note is that in terms of categorical data, such as this year in 2020, we started asking questions about whether hives were used in the field. We need to collect a bit more information to be able to do some robust analysis on this, because, for example, we only had 2 entries that said that they could use hives in the field. We had 39 entries registered in 2020, and it's obviously been a difficult season. So we had 32 of which were able to return yields this year. We added in 20 yields from last year. And this gave a total data set of 52 yields to work with. Most of the varieties in the bean yen data set are spring bean entries. Next slide, please, Dan. So Dan's already covered how we factor weather into your report, and the next section in your report that you'll see will be site factors or soil factors. So the top 50% of the yields that we analysed averaged 5.8 tonnes per hectare, with the bottom averaging 3.7 tonnes per hectare. Anything that came out as significant in our analysis will be highlighted in red text, and there's nothing significant on this slide that we've seen. But you'll see that levels of soil organic matter were relatively similar between the bottom and top 50% of the data set. And the same with CO2 respiration, which is a measure of microbial activity. There seemed to be high silt contents in the higher yielding half of the data set, although this wasn't significant. And we didn't see any effects of pH in our data set. We didn't see any effects of soil phosphorus, magnesium or potassium levels, but if you look at the soil indices in the second column, you can see that on average, most of the data fell in soil index 2. Next slide, please, Dan. Thank you. So the next part of the report that we'd go through is resource capture. And again, Dan has covered how we estimate that your crop captures water and light. So I'm not going to talk about that. But we do estimate nutrition or nutrient capture at this stage using land crop leaf tissue nutrient analysis. So most of the data for the bean yen in 2020 was captured at flowering or between growth stage 60 and 69. We didn't do tissue testing in 2019, so this is just 2020 data. We see that there was a positive association in with levels of potassium in the leaves and high yields, similar to what Becky saw in the PGRO and Hummingbird project. We didn't see any associations with the other nutrients that were measured at this time. Next slide, please, Ben. Thank you. So then we move on to crop development, and this is where we separated the data into spring and winter crops. And I have to give an apology at this stage because we've noticed and become aware of an issue with how the data has pulled through into the report. So for the harvest dates, this is actually the date of senescence in that shown on the charts, and so on and so forth. So we will correct this data and reissue it either shortly before or after the new year. Next slide. Oh, sorry. So, well, it's a very similar piece of information for winter and spring. When you look at the dates on their own, we don't see any significant effects in the data set. But if you look at the season length, again, although it isn't significant, it seems to be higher for in spring and winter crops. Next slide, please, Dan. If you take the data set as a whole and include winter and spring together, then the length of flowering to harvest is significantly associated with yield. Thanks, Dan. So then we move on to agronomy and crop protection, and a lot of the information we capture is categorical data, but we are able to test the amount of rates of applications at this stage using this type of analysis. So when we looked at the rate of phosphorus, potassium and sulfur applications, we didn't see any associations with yield, and the same with the number of herbicide, insecticide or fungicide applications. Next slide, please, Dan. So yield components are a really important part of the yen report, and they're really useful because they tell the physiological story of how your crop arrived at its final yield. So we're starting off at the top row, plant height. This was nearly significant in our analysis. So you can see that the top 50% of entries were usually taller plants, or it was getting to that way in terms of significance. The high yielding entries also had more seeds per meter squared, a high 1,000 seed weight, a high harvest index, and a higher individual shoot biomass. So they had each shoot was larger. You might notice that shoots per plant is negatively associated with yield here, and that could potentially be confounded with the fact that we're analysing both spring and winter varieties together, and spring varieties tend to branch less than winter varieties. And at least in 2020, the spring varieties had a slightly higher yield than the winter varieties. You'll notice at the very bottom there's a value as beans lost behind the combine in meters squared, and this, although it isn't a yield component, was an interesting one to add in here because it's negatively associated with yield. So we asked people to count the amount of beans that fall behind the combine at harvest, and you'll notice that the top 50% of yields had less harvest losses. And if you multiply these beans per meter squared by the 1,000 seed weights of the crop, that counts to around 0.2 of a hectare difference. Thanks, Dan. So we finish off the report in the data section with seed analysis, and you'll notice that we don't see any significant associations with nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, magnesium or manganese levels in the seeds harvest, but we did see a negative association with boron levels, similar again to what Becky saw in the hummingbird data set in leaf tissue analysis. This might not mean that boron is particularly bad to the crop. It could be that we're seeing an element of yield dilution at this stage. One really interesting thing that we saw from the data set is that bruchid beetle damage was negatively associated with yield. So the top 50% of yields had on average lower bruchid beetle damage. And it could be easy to think that bruchid beetles create holes in the seeds and therefore creating lighter seeds and less yield. But we have to remember that this is associations, and that we have to take in weather and temperature into account. So one thing we have noticed and haven't put in our presentation today is that yields are negatively associated with June and July temperatures. So areas with warmer June and July temperatures, you see negative yields, and that might also be associated with bruchid beetle activity. So it's hard to tease that apart at this stage. Thanks, Dan. So what messages can we take away from the data set so far? So we have to remember that these are preliminary associations, but if we take the averages for crop development, we see some associations with, or we tend to see some linkages with season length and yield. If you take the data set as a whole, you'll see an association with the date of flowering to harvest. If you think about yield components, plants with large shoots, many pods, many seeds per shoot, and high thousand seed weights and harvest indices are associated with high yields. And this is similar to what we find in the cereal yen. So this is quite interesting, but it is not necessarily what we find in other crops like peas. In time, we hope to be able to analyse more of the categorical data analysis, and that might help us identify practices that are leading to the yield components that we see above. And again, in terms of the theme of data collection, we're hoping that over many seasons, we'll be able to tease apart the environmental effects from other effects we see. For example, trying to see whether bruchid beetle damage is masked by summer temperatures or not. So thanks a lot, Dan, and I'll pass back over to Roger.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. I'm afraid with the hiccups with the slides, we're running a bit behind schedule. So there's lots of chat in the conversation box, so please keep all that happening. But in the meantime, well, one of the prime protagonists is John Charles Jones, who I would like to invite to turn on his webcam and his microphone and join me, and we will. John, if you can.
I'm not on mute, so I should be.
There you are. I see
right.
you.
Right. I don't know what happened there. Right. Well, how long have I got?
Well, just a couple of minutes, really. If you could just describe very briefly your farm and then your bean crop this year. Now, just to tell everybody that the 3 farmers we've got have all got spring bean crops. So we don't actually have anybody talking about winter beans this evening. Over to you, John.
Right. So the main slide seems to have disappeared now, but we're relatively small farmers. We've been in bean yen for 2 years. In old money we farm 400 acres of combinable crops, of which 50% is usually in wheat, 25% in rape, and 25% in beans, spring beans. We've grown beans, I suppose, really on this farm. We only moved to this farm in the early noughties, but since 2013 we've grown 6 crops, and it's probably my favourite crop on the farm. Now I say that not because we're good at it, and that's why I'm a member of Bean Yen, in that I want to get better and learn from you other buggers, but I'm just interested in margin, and rather bizarrely our average gross margin over the last 5 years in growing spring beans is actually higher than our gross margin from growing wheat. Now that probably reflects again, what a poor wheat grower we are. But, you know, I'm all about margin. I couldn't really give a damn about yield, although I recognise that yield and margin invariably are synonymous. I actually, at the start of this, I put my hand up and said I was disappointed with our yield. In actual fact, given the weather of the season, I was actually delighted in it. But compared with our 5-year average yield or 6-year average yield, we were below. Our six-year average yield is 5.5, and our average this year was just under 4.9. Although our actual yen field actually did 5.5 exactly. So the weather, I think, played. We don't believe in early drilling. If we can get it in early, all well and good. We've got heavy clay soils here, although this particular field was a better one. So the ground was so wet this time that we could not get on, and indeed I think we drilled. We didn't start drilling until early April. And I learned a lot in 2013 from this, which actually was an even wetter spring for us. And then we didn't start planting until the middle of April, against the advice of everybody else, I might add, except PGRO. But we learned a lot that year in that most of our beans went in the 3rd week of April, and we averaged 5.6. So I'm not really bothered with drilling date. It's all about the conditions that they drill into, and if the conditions aren't right, we hold off. Sometimes to our detriment. In 2018, we held off and held off and held off. And by the beginning of May, we decided we really shouldn't bother, and we were very pleased subsequently that we did. Right, I probably exceeded my 2 minutes. So.
That's very good. Thank you very much, John. If you turn yourself off for the moment, and we'll bring you back up again when we have the discussion, okay? So now over to Sam Cook, who hopefully is ready and waiting.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. So yeah, I suppose really echo what John was just saying. Similar sort of land type there, quite predominant heavy soils. And as you can see in that photo there, actual establishment, I think it's a no-till system there that they've been running for the last 10, 12 years, I believe now. And the story for us again was down to the weather. South Lincolnshire there, I think we actually last season copped it the hardest. I think a lot of the growers there would argue. We had a hideously wet autumn followed by a wet start to spring, and then towards the end of March there, it very quickly became extremely dry. As you can see on there, the straw residues struggling to break down, the soil was very dry. But this crop in particular, it did do quite well. Looking at the data set for it, it threw a lot of pods per shoot. I think one of the highest within this being yen, so it was great there to see the comparisons with everyone else. And again, one of the latest drilled, showing that workload in South Lincolnshire was nearly 100% for most farmers. Many didn't get anything drilled in the autumn. And then again, looking at that solar radiation there, May again, so the crop drilled late April, or late April there, just showing that when we really had all that heat and, well, drought for us during April and May, the crop really wasn't able to make the most of that. And then in the critical months of June, July and August, where we hoped to see that then pods fill up with beans, we really struggled to get that pod fill, consequently having quite a low seed weight, which I think in hand had quite an impact on the yield. So though the potential was there, we just simply didn't get that final fill.
Is that it, Sam?
That'll do for me. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's brilliant. And so now we can ask Victor Love to come online as well. And we're gradually building our panel. Victor, are you there?
Hello.
Excellent. I can hear you. I can't see you yet.
Well, hold on.
Yep, there you are.
All right.
And you're in a very different part of the world.
Yeah. Just go as far north and west as you can, pretty much over the pond from basically everybody else here. We suffer terribly with the weather. It's basically the weather toilet as regards the weather. A lot of rain. The previous year's beans, the moisture meter wouldn't even read what moisture they were. They were that wet, but this year wasn't so bad. They were 24% off a combine. But again, like a lot of other people, I wait for my drilling time. So this year they were drilled on the 30th of March. Really nice conditions, but then like a lot of other people, and shockingly for here, we turned incredibly dry. They did suffer, but then the rain did come and they kept going. Strange thing happened. They stopped flowering and podding, so there was like on the top of the plant there'd been like 1.5 feet of healthy plant, but no pods, no flowers. And then we managed to get them cut in September, which is a first because normally it's been October. And this year's variety was fanfare for the first time. But it's amazing when you see the charts as regards solar radiation, because like, you know, with living here we don't get the sun, but when you see the charts it's just ridiculous, you know. We just don't see it. But the beans seem to be quite happy, you know, they seem to pod well. Had awful trouble with slugs this year. I think they just had a 7-month orgy over the winter. And but yeah, I was pleasantly surprised because definitely you knew the plant number wasn't there, but you know, they still did okay, you know.
Victor, can you just say a little bit about your farm and in particular whether you have livestock, because so often in the ends we find that livestock and cropping go very well together. Crop yields anyway.
No, I basically am just arable now. We used to keep a lot of pigs, and that has probably stuck to the phosphate staying so high for so long. But no, just I've been basically the soil was being destroyed. It was growing maize for dairy farmers, and I figured something had to change. So I've been direct drilling for the past 12 years, doing cheap cover crops and then just a lot of spring cropping. So it's winter wheat, spring barley, spring beans, and then like hay and haylage for horses. Okay. If I can get a bit of soy, or more importantly, farmyard manure, I do, but I haven't got any the past few years. So that's pretty much it.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's excellent. So if now the whole panel can join me with their microphones on and their webcams on. So Shona and Becky and Daniel and John and Sam, can you all join us? I think possibly we don't need the slides anymore now, Dan. And then we can see some faces. So now I haven't been following the chat. Well, could the speakers give us a rough clay percentage in their yen fields? Do you know, have you got your reports to hand? Do you know what your clay percentages were? Yeah, well, John.
I think we were just under 25% looking at our result, which I have to say, I mean, it's probably the kindest field on the farm. So if any field was going to yield reasonably, we'd expect it to be that. And I think the ravages of the very dry spring were less on this particular field. So we did get a good establishment. and that would have helped. I mean, on the high clay content this time, they were crucified. We had an extraordinarily dry spring. I mean, we had 1 millimetre of rain between 20th of March and the 28th of April. We then had 11 millimetres over a few days, and then we had 1 millimetre between the 2nd of May and the 3rd of June. So we had these extraordinarily dry periods, the like of which we haven't seen before on this farm. So when the rain did eventually come, sort of about the middle of June, my God, it was welcome.
And you were drilling 50 seeds per square metre. There's I think probably, the importance of establishment. We need to understand your establishment policy. So Sam, over to you.
Yeah, no, I'd put on there. I'm probably being a bit kind, calling it 35% clay. I think the grower is on here. I think he'd probably say it's probably a little bit more than that. But again, seed rate, yeah, same as John. We're aiming for that 40 plants per metre squared. And I did do a few plant counts, and we were very close to getting there. And again, without getting a diary to hand, them rainfall events and that 6 weeks in May, I think we recorded 2 mil in them 6 weeks, with a week of it at 30 degrees plus, just shows that, and in this particular case, the resilience of their soils, holding what tiny bit of moisture they did have available just to get that seed to germinate in the first place.
Yeah. Victor, do you know your clay content?
Yeah, it's coming up with 20%.
20%.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we've got a comment from David Backman saying that anything under 75% is pretty easy soil as far as he's concerned. So you're all on pretty easy land. Right. So yeah, David's saying he's got. Any idea how deep your roots go? But because, and I mean, it's actually less easy, I'm sure, to judge on a spring sown crop than on a winter sown crop. But have you done any digging, John?
Not to get to the bottom of the roots, no. Might as well be honest.
I mean, it's one of the things in all the yens that we put such huge store on the amount of water that is actually held in soil if you can get the roots down into it. And Sam, any experience of digging holes?
Yeah, we've been doing quite a lot of that, and I think most people would probably say going forward we seem to be doing a lot more of that, trying to see how the roots are getting down and looking at the soil compositions becoming more and more important. And this year in particular, we were trialling different nutrients as a trial on there, and I could definitely see that we were able to enhance that rooting and get it a little bit deeper, or get them tunneling down a bit further simply by giving some nutrients earlier on in the program, PK type foliar nutrition.
Okay, and you're thinking of the nutrients actually encouraging depth?
Yes, well, it's in that case, I think, where they were probably struggling, or where we hadn't put any foliar applications on the rooting depth. I've got some quite good photographs that show that we were positively having an impact on that rooting depth.
Okay, I mean, we generally, when we appreciate the difficulty of increasing rooting depth, probably the first thing we think of after, well, avoiding compaction is worms.
I suppose perhaps I should have added, I mean, we, rightly or wrongly, we do go through with a low disturbance subsoil, and we do that every year. And we think that's actually really important. So, I mean, I would echo exactly what Sam says. Yes, sorry, we dig holes, but I didn't dig down to find out the deepest depth of the roots. So yeah, I misunderstood your question, perhaps.
Victor, I don't think your problem is rooting depth, probably, because you get rain every day of the year.
Yeah, it certainly feels like it. I've dug pits because I'd shock and bother with compaction about, that started me into the direct drilling, and then I had massive compaction at 12 inches running to 15 inches. But I've never dug to see what way the roots are going in the beans. But all I know is that the soil is incredibly friable. Once the beans are out, it's just perfect for drilling wheat into.
Yeah.
So I don't know what kind of effect they have on the ground, but the soil changes after them, But it does seem to you have to get something in that autumn/winter, or else if it overwinters like that, it turns into something resembling concrete. But no, the rooting seems to be fine. It's funny, I've never dug down, and I must do it sometime, just next year to see. But yeah.
Okay, I'm just wondering whether we could think about, I mean, you've all grown spring beans this year, but I presume you all have grown winter beans.
No.
No.
Well, the closest we've ever come to it was actually last year in 2019, when we planted our spring beans on the 31st of October. And I was enormously excited by that. And but the weather hasn't allowed us to do it since. So, but that was superb.
And it was superb all the way to harvest.
Well, it was. Funnily enough, I mean, we averaged last year 5.85, which is not the highest bean yield that we've had. That was, funnily enough, in 2016. And I was actually, without sounding greedy, slightly disappointed as that, because the crop did look absolutely, I mean, it was just textbook stuff from the day it was drilled to the day that we harvested it. And I was a bit surprised that it didn't yield more than that. But again, we did have, and I can't remember the details now, but we had an excruciatingly dry period during the season. And I think that it probably hit the crop at the wrong time, because the crop was well advanced. And bearing in mind, I think we probably harvested it, I don't know, 15th, 19th of August, I think, from memory. So, that was almost not quite a month earlier than we would normally harvest. But it ticked so many boxes for us that, we will do that again. If we get the chance, we'll do that again immediately.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering whether, let's see, how are we going? I want to have a bit more discussion about your agronomy and so on, but then we'll move on to thinking about the yen next year. So we want to think about how we can, first of all, attract, we want more yields, because if we don't get more yields, we don't learn anything more. So we want everybody to be thinking about how we can get more members of the yen in the future. But let's I want to now go to Becky and ask whether you've got any issues you want to raise with the panel members, Becky.
I think in terms of agronomy, I'd say this year's been, as I said in my presentation, it's been quite mixed. I think John, it was you made the comment about Brookid, wasn't it? So the data that we've got for Brookid is around, so that comes from Frontier, so it's every single sample that they evaluate in the UK, so that's thousands of samples. So, but the way we've mapped it is averages. So going back to your point about, I know some people, and we know in the yen that some people had very high levels of Brookid damage, but there's lots of factors in that mixture as well, and I think that's for growers' choice actually as well. A lot of growers are choosing not to apply insecticides to a flowering crop, and that's perfectly understandable.
Funny enough, that was exactly what we did this year. And because, I mean, we've thrown the book at Brookid in the past, trying to get the premium, and it would appear to have been pot luck more often than not. This year, we didn't apply any, and we still got 30, I think we got just over a third of our crop will have passed consumption. God knows why. I wish I knew.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what brings up that real point about temperature being of critical importance, and that's often the way, obviously, with insect pests anyway. So I think we would expect that. But what I would say, put to the growers in the panel, and maybe Victor, I know we talked last week a little bit about some of the issues that you have, certainly with chocolate spot. How was that for over on your farm this year?
Basically, you can see where the last spray went for fungicide. Just towards the end, the plant will be completely like a burnt out tree on the top. You know, there's just not a bit of leaf or greenery left. This year, strangely, wasn't too bad, but we're just really scared of going too hard with fungicides here, because generally it's an October harvest and we need them to ripen, we need them to die off, and the chocolate spot kind of helps that along a bit. So it's like a balancing act. But I would wipe them clean if you weren't careful with fungicides. No, it definitely. August can be the wettest month in the whole year.
Do you think you mentioned the issue of sort of lack of pod set and flower set in certain parts of the plant? Do you think that was related to chocolate spot, or do you think it was related to the weather?
There was no sign of chocolate spot. You know, there was no sign of it in the plant, and the plant was healthy on it. You know, there was leaf and stem for like 1.5 feet, 45 centimeters. But there was just no flowers and no pod set at all. Just a healthy plant, and all I can put it down was the dry. We had a bit of dry, and it was my first year with Fanfare, and like Boxer definitely behaved differently. I have no idea really. You know, it's kind of I was wondering if anybody had a clue why it did that. You know.
Yeah. Can we ask that? Because I mean, there were several growers in the reports who commented on the same thing this year, that there was a lack of, you know, that top foot, you know, or 18 inches just had pods, but they just weren't filling. I mean, can we ask everybody who's on the call, if that was something you saw a lot of this year, just to put your hand up, see if we can get Roger's system to work, you know, just to gauge how many people saw that effect of, you know, those top pods just not filling.
You're going to have to ask the alternative as well, Dan.
Well, we'll see about 12. I mean,
13. I've got 13.
13 out of 30 of you. Well, there's more than that, I guess. 40 of you left. Yeah. Well, who didn't see any issues then? Just to Dave Rogers. Let's go with Rogers.
Get them to take their hands down first. It's got to go back to naught. It's nearly there.
No one's going to admit to not having seen any issues.
Now you can.
I mean, to me, that's one of the key questions of this. Is, you know, what's driving that kind of thing? Is it kind of, you know, a disease thing? Is it a temperature thing, or is it just, you know, like we see, it was just dark, you know, started off being quite bright, and then we got into that dull phase, you know, because potentially, you know, beans could be a sink limitation could be the thing which is really limiting yields here, and that's something that maybe we need to solve with the breeders, you know, as much as anything else. Or is there something there that we could do to mitigate it? Is it, you know, nutrition or biostimulants or whatever else? I don't know.
I would think it's fair to say that yeah, the top flowers did not pod anything like as well as I suppose they had the potential to, but it's very difficult to be precise exactly why that is.
I mean, the other option is pollination, isn't it? And so we have been asking in this whether, you know, people having proximity to hives. And we've got quite a good response on that, but there isn't any difference in the data so far between people who are saying they're close to a hive or not close to a hive.
I mean, certainly. I mean, we had tremendous flowering this year, and also that coincided during, I suppose, that dry spell. So I mean, you know, there was a really long period of much longer than normal, I would suggest, this year because of the weather, and we had a very good pod set from the earlier flowers. But yes, probably less good from the later, but that's quite common, I would suggest, probably, or there seems to be on ours.
Can I ask whether you had to leave any, and there's comment on the chat about a lot of low pods, and certainly around us there were farmers failing to harvest half their crop. Did you see that?
I thought we were going to see a lot more than we did get. We certainly saw it on a much heavier land that had established, you know, where the drought really did affect the establishment. That was noticeable, but I think, funnily enough, the rain that we had in sort of June, July, it did seem to lift the whole plants up surprisingly. So it wasn't as big a problem as I'd expected it to be.
Okay. Sam, any comment?
Again, yeah, I think that on the whole, the crop for us did stand quite tall. Again, comparing it to the others, it was one of the taller crops. And again, put that down to the resilience of the soil or the rainfall, and just giving it that kick when it really needed it. But yeah, pod set was generally quite pleasing, and yeah, there wasn't too much left in the field really.
So really, over and all, if we'd only had a bit more sunshine in June, July, they would have been stonking yields.
I would have liked to have thought so. Yeah, it looked pleasing all year. There was some late rust as well that came into the crop. Did that hinder it? Did it not? Jury's still out on that a bit. I know it certainly helped send them home. It's very limited chemistry we've got now for desiccating beans. But yeah, for me, it was really that lack of sunshine when it really needed it.
Yeah.
Okay, can we? We've got about 4 minutes left. If we can just turn our minds to the future, and I'm hoping that our panel members would all say they're going to re-enter Bean Yen next year. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And do you have any friends or neighbours who you can challenge to join the Bean Yen as well?
I mean, I'll be brutally honest. One of the attractions of the last 2 years is it hasn't cost me anything. So I think if there were more sponsors and it was known earlier in the season that there wasn't going to be a charge, I genuinely think that you would be able to persuade more people to join in.
Yeah.
There seemed to be a little bit of uncertainty on that until quite late in the day, but that might be just me being mean. I don't know, but I can't believe I'm the only mean farmer.
I agree with you, John, but I had as part of Frontier, we had quite a few trials that we were trying to use, and the only one where I got an even establishment to replicate an area as such was the trial that we're discussing today. Everywhere else, it was that and even an establishment. It was just simply unfair to try and to compare them, really. Victor, in Northern Ireland, how many neighbours grow beans?
None. Basically, it's strange. I get my seed and stuff over in Donegal because I'm right on the border with Donegal, and they're getting £100 an acre, or 250 quid a hectare for growing them, but nobody grows them over there, And you think Donegal, like there is crops growing in Donegal, but it's just funny nobody grows them, and there's nobody else really around here. There'd be more over in East Northern Ireland, but not. I don't know of anybody else here at the minute. Nobody's stupid enough anyway.
Okay, just let me ask some questions just about the mechanics of being a Yen member and having to send us samples. We've got one thing we really want to emphasize, and that is if you want to know the total amount of biomass your crop is, and we definitely do want to know this, then you need to cut your plants at ground level. Now, is that a problem? Because this year, on the cereals and on the beans, it has, as far as we can see, been a problem for some people. Is that a difficulty?
It was only a problem for me in that I didn't do it. I thought I was being kinder by putting just taking the beans, cutting them below the lowest pod. So I don't think it actually would have made a huge difference, but instinctively I think perhaps the instructions could have been clearer, or else I need to read them better. I don't know. I'd have to go back and find out exactly what was asked for.
We'll try and make sure it's clear anyway. Yeah, and would you be willing to do something like taking an overhead photo soon after establishment, so that we can get a decent plant count, because really, you know, we're seeing establishment as being so important, and if we can get good establishment data by a photograph or by counting, I don't know, which would you prefer?
Photograph be no problem. Yeah, I can't see it being a problem. Yeah.
Okay. Dan, Tom, any points you want to add?
No, I mean, I would add to that because I mean, I think the moment the way we're getting the shoots or branches or plants per metre squared is by deriving it into yield, and I'm not confident in the results we're getting in that so far. And as Tom said, I think we really need to get that that as a direct measure would be much better, because it is such an important thing. And I think at the moment about 50% of growers are kind of returning kind of plant counts, but we're not necessarily getting that, you know, on all the data sets. So that would be something to push. But I mean, the challenge of all this is that there's so much we'd like to measure, and so, you know, all things around soil, you know, as well, you know, capturing that soil information much better, and, you know, rooting depth and lots of other things. So it's kind of not wanting to get good data, but without overwhelming you all.
Can I just check that there's one hand up that says the Emmets.
I think it's been up most of the afternoon.
Has it? Okay. Just checking that somebody isn't bursting to say something. Okay. Well, I think it's my job now to thank everyone. And first of all, Sam and Victor and John, you know, excellent. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your experiences with us, and for saying you're willing to carry on with us into the future. I mean, as Tom emphasized, you know, it's about collecting a cohesive set of data with trustworthy yields and trustworthy measurements to go with those yields, which will help us to understand really what's happening on farm. And in the end, when we've collected enough, you know, the more yields, I think, John, you were asking about this, but the more yields, the more finesse we'll have in our knowledge. And that's really the essence of the ends. So let's just keep going, and you know, the sponsors are all interested in the results, so hopefully they'll keep supporting us, and the whole show will carry on the road.
So you can register your winter bean crops now on the website. You go to www.yen.adash.co.uk. I saw that James from BASF was offering BASF sponsorship to anybody, so there you go, John.
Could I just ask one very cheeky question of Sam? I was fascinated that you've been direct drilling spring beans, and I've been led to believe that spring beans are possibly one crop that does not like spring drilling. Just very quickly, what are your experiences of it, and what are your thoughts?
I think generically, yeah, I would probably say a Claydon type approach, or traditionally that bit more disturbance, giving them a bit of room. Beans, I've liked it, but this year in particular, when we went from them moist soils to hideously dry, it was very evident where they were direct drilled, there'd been less soil disturbance, they were up and away far quicker and didn't seem to get held back. I didn't have that field in particular, or the whole block, to be fair to the grower, was corner to corner, every bean germinated. Whereas neighbouring farm next door, very similar soil type, very different cultivations. They struggled to make a seed bed, disked it up, knocked it down again, eventually got it drilled, and there was whole areas of the field that simply didn't come. So.
Well, my own experience, I've worked with a little TSAM. I've only ever direct drilled the beans, and they've been one of the crops that's been generally, by and large, totally happy with it, you know, because it was a steep learning curve at the start, and but the beans were never a problem, you know, and the little Aitchison can stick them on 4 inches, no problem, you know. It's only a little drill, like, it's not a big, you know, it's not like a big tillage train or something. So, but the beans seem to be totally happy with it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you. I mean, this has been a brilliant discussion, and it clearly could go on and on and on, but it's my job to bring it to a close and to thank you all very much. Thank you also to Shona and to Becky from PGRO and all the people behind the scenes at the PGRO who are listening in. Thank you very much indeed. This collaboration is, I think, working pretty well, and you know, the longer we keep at it, the better we'll get at it. So thank you very much to the PGRO. Thank you to all our other sponsors, and to everyone who's listening in. Thank you for your attention. It's been really good to see so many people and to have all your comments. As Dan says, you can register. We're going to do much more online data entry and registration this year, so keep looking for the emails and the newsletters that'll tell you what to do, but you can go on the website anytime and it'll tell you what to do. So and there's always the email address. If you just yen@adas.co.uk. we have a full-time yen manager now, Deval Patel, who's very pleased to answer any questions, and he's very efficient. So please just keep the interaction going, and thank you very much for your attention. And this is the yen team can draw a sigh of relief, because this is the last of many yen webinars that we've done this year. So we're all looking forward to our Christmas break, and may I wish you all a good Christmas break and a good evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
I hope I didn't forget anyone.
Are we still recording, Roger?